Hi, welcome to Dead Air Live. I'm Jean Flanagan, and tonight we're going to be talking about quilts and quilters. I come from a family of sewers, and my mom actually has traced back her side of the family 6 generations to women who have been either professional sewers or semi-professional sewers, which is pretty amazing. We go back to Wales and Ireland and Germany. So that's pretty wild. But what my mom sewed, she started out as a doing dresses and teaching tailoring and sewing, and she went to boat covers. When I was about 8, she and a friend of hers opened up a shop, and they made boat covers because boats don't change sizes in between fittings. So that was my mom's whole rationale for going and changing over into boats and marine canvas. So I grew up actually sewing for her in that regard, and just sewing clothes at home. And since my mom's retired, she's become a serious quilter. So we're going to see a lot of her quilting and stash, and I just came back from being down there for a week of dyeing cloth for quilting, so we'll see some of that. And my sister, and the other quilter we're going to feature is my sister-in-law, and she worked for my mom, and that's how my brother met her. And she sewed for my mom, and is very precise, very wonderful precision, and she loves doing quilts. So we're going to see some quilts she's done, and some of her miniature quilts, which are absolutely phenomenal for how tiny they are and how many pieces they are. So we're going to start by looking at the stash of quilts and planning the projects. So let's go to the first roll-in and look at my mom's stash. This is her basic sewing room. This is half the room split in half. She's got this is her sewing space, and the other side is the computer space, so there's not much left in the computer space.
This is my clothing department. This is thread and mostly clothing. This is Christmas fabrics and some baby quilt fabrics. We have reds and purples. My stash is small. And over here we have the blues and the greens. This is last week. And here we have blacks, yellow and gold, and browns. I don't use brown very much. But now and then you need a basket, so you need browns. And these are orientals. My whole stack of orientals. One of these days I will get my oriental done. These are just prints, kind of favorite fabrics, and some neutrals and beiges. Oh yes, turquoise. I have so many turquoise that I have to separate them from blue and green. And this has my beautiful indigos. I'm waiting for a special project to put those into. And I have a number of fancy fabrics, sheers to overlay, and lamés.
And this is my sister-in-law's. She's only showing you a small part of the stash, but we're going to look at the planning the project parts. And those are actually her hand dyes. She loves to make all her hand dyes very flat, very even colors. And we'll talk about hand dyes in a moment when we go to the next segment. But you get all these wild fabrics, and you have to figure out how they go together. So she likes to put some pretty bright colors together, and pretty traditional. She's got a whole series of baby quilts. She's a school teacher. And she's got a whole bunch of pregnant school teachers that she's working with. So she has a whole set of baby quilts. This is my mom's current major project. And she's gotten out almost everything in her stash to do this project.
This dragon was given to me, and I took it to a class. And it's being put together with a form of flying geese, working with rectangles And then onto the rectangle, you put triangles. And you can put them on ends like this. You can put them on like that. You can put, I don't know if I have any more right here. No, I don't. You can put 2 of them on. Here's another one. You can crisscross them like this, so that your pieces have an assortment of directions, and then you just play with them and see what goes where. And I've tried to follow the colors that exist on the dragon and take those out and then build on that.
So a lot of these are
And
actually
these are just some of the fabrics that are going.
overprinted hand dyes and batiks
2 years.
that give these wonderful mellow,
May need take another 2.
sort of almost
I
a
keep
knot
saying
print
it.
form.
When I finally get all the borders on, then I'm hoping to bead the dragon around all his scales.
So you can see the
Being
batik
experienced
on
from
top
this one,
of
that's
the
gonna
hand
work.
dyes.
I think
And
it'll
he's all
be-
batiqued, and that's how he gets all those little white spots. They wax on to keep the color off, and then they dye it in multicolors. So she's trying to follow the colors out into the border, and we were then discussing what she wants to do as an outer edge frame.
You actually piece on squares, not triangles, and you wind up with a set of small squares that are composed of 2 triangles, and that's why there's
So there you can see some
Here
of the
and there,
little
there's a
squares that
section
get
in
cut
there.
off as you
all these smaller
cut
triangles.
pieces.
It just lends interest to the shape and size of the pieces. Gone it just so long, and then you just kind of have to stop and start afresh.
Welcome back. Well, I hope you enjoyed seeing my mom's long-term project. If you caught it, she said she's been working on it for 2 years. So clearly that piano has been covered with pieces for 2 years. She retired about 12 years ago and has been just started quilting. She hadn't really done much of any quilting before that, and didn't really consider herself an artist. So now, as she's been working with so much color, you can see her quilts change over the year and how expressive her colors are, how adventuresome she is. And she's taking watercolor classes and oil painting classes and stuff to make sure that she continues this whole art study, which is basically what she's doing as in her retirement. So she's having a ball, not having a problem being retired at all. So I want to show you a couple of samples of the things that we have, that I have, that are in my house. And one of which is my sister made me a number of years ago this lovely frog, because I collect frogs. And so he's actually all hand quilted. And so she pieced together, he's pretty basic, mostly out of one piece of fabric, and then this piece is overlaid, and the flower is actually 3-dimensional and made and put on the top of the flower. And so he hangs up on my sewing room wall. And this quilt actually is it's not a quilt yet. And this is what many quilts in houses really look like. Before the whole idea of making quilts as wall hangings was so popular, you really thought about making a quilt. And this quilt is actually one that I started when I was in high school. And I dragged all these pieces around, and I actually did hand sewing when I grew up in the country, and when you had to go in a car or on the bus, you went everywhere. And I've hand pieced all the pieces together of the quilt. And so that's as far as I've gotten. So someday I'll make it into a wall hanging or do something interesting with it. But right now it just stays folded up. And you can actually date quilts by the fabrics that are in them, and we'll look a little bit more at that in a moment. I don't have any hand-dyed quilts with me. The next segment we're going to look at is actually the hand-dyed segment. My mom and I spent a whole week dyeing cloth. It was my vacation. I went down a couple of weeks ago, and luckily she's in South Carolina, so it was nice and warm. And we were out in the barn, and we dyed cloth. We started at noon every day and got done about midnight, because you just sort of get into this whole routine and you have to get all the fabric in. You have to let it sit for a couple of hours. We'd go off and do something else, come back. Then you'll watch some of the rinsing, and you'll watch some of the process of dyeing cloth. So let's look at that segment. So you buy a whole bolt of what's called ready to dye. Oh, the sound's a little off track.
Okay, that's it.
The fabric is called prepared for dyeing, PFD. It's made white and it's been washed, and we bought a 20-yard roll of it, and then we bought various and sundry pieces of other kinds of fabric. We dyed almost 40 yards of fabric over that week. She's mixing turquoise right now. Doesn't look very turquoise, looks pretty dark blue, but so much washes out that the colors never look, you never know what they're going to be. This is the chemical bath. She has hard water down there, so it has water softener in it, but it has soda ash, which makes it the right pH for the dyes to best take hold, and lots and lots of salt. We went through 4 boxes of the big boxes of kosher salt. And I pour it in a baggie. There's 2 cups in each baggie, and she's going to put the turquoise. She's going to put, I believe it was 7 tablespoons of turquoise in that bag, 5 in the next bag, 3 in the next bag, and 1. And we're doing what's called a graduated mixed, no, this was a parent dye. So we go to turquoise. Most turquoise is in this bag, all the way down through 5 bags. And then the empty bag, we put in fuchsia, 7 fuchsia, and then go back down. And now she's mixing the fuchsia. And that'll go in the bag that has no turquoise in it. And then we'll mix fuchsia and turquoise, and we come up with all these wonderful purples. And we did the cloth dry in order to get a lot of coloration, color variation. We ended up with these very crystalline looking fabrics. And so this one is the turquoise. And you just stuff a half a yard of fabric in, and then you squeeze the bag, and then you mush it all around. And she lost, these bags were a little smaller than some of the other ones we're doing. It's messy, it's not an indoor task.
Extreme sports.
But we were in the barn, on the front side of the barn. We had the big doors, front doors wide open, so had great outdoor. And you can see this still looks turquoise, even though this now has some fuchsia in it. And you still looks blue. This is bag 3 of this 6-bag series. Still looks pretty blue. And bag 4, and we see a tiny bit of purple, but it doesn't look like it's changing very much.
This one's purple.
And here we are in bag 5, so we see how much blue. Now it really does look purple. But when you look at the colors in the final tally, they don't look anything like what you're seeing. And this is fuchsia. Now fuchsia is a very purpley pink, and it looks pretty orange-red, actually. So then after we'd let the bags sit for about 3 hours, we kneaded them a little bit to make sure everything was wet, but we didn't want to knead them so much to even the color out. So then we used the garden hose again. We used a ton of water, and we did a first rinse outside.
Yummy.
And there's the purple, one of the middle colors as it comes out. And in fact, here's the fuchsia when it comes out, and it has that brilliant red look to it. And then we've done a first rinse, and then we go in with hot water in the kitchen sink. And this is what we did from about 9 o'clock to midnight with all our cloth. Each night, we dyed probably anywhere from 5 to 12 yards each day. And just, yep, the hottest water you could do. I wouldn't want to live in the desert and be paying 25 cents a gallon for the amount of water we use. And then one more time, and it's still got a little bit of color in it. So until that water runs almost clear, then when that's all done, we take our little balls of fabric and we throw them all in the washing machine with some special soap that keeps the last of the dye suspended. You dry it halfway in the dryer and then you iron it out. This is actually a tablecloth we dyed. She has an extra large size table. So we bought some nice scenery muslin, which is 3 yards wide. This is a piece of silk we dyed. And here's the hand dyes that we did. This is what we created in the cottons. And you can see that the colors really don't have a lot to do with what you saw in the picture. We'll go back and I'll show you the ones that we were mostly looking at. This is the fuchsia. And you can see the crystal and structures, and then the purples are just stunning. They really, my mom loves to work with purple, so she'll use these for quilts off, and then the turquoise at the bottom. And this is a brown to red series, brown to magenta series actually. So that's the magenta on the bottom, in the middle there, and then it goes up and becomes that darker brown. So these are all done by formula, so you can redo, we can recalculate any one of these pieces of cloth. If we want to do more of it or we want to do that color again, we have written down all the things that we did. And this is a blue to yellow series. This is a midnight blue to golden yellow. Gives me all the muddy greens that I work with. This does not have midnight blue or golden yellow in it. It's only mixed colors. And this is just a gradation of dark green. So this dark green, then we just put progressively less amounts of dye into the 2 cups and then got progressively less color in them. Well, that was dyeing the cloth. Now a lot of people don't dye cloth. We'd never done it before. My mom loves to use hand dyes, and I like to work with interesting shades that aren't really patterns. But when you don't work with hand dyes, you have to go out and you have to think about color. And so I want to show you this really quite traditional, which is another one made by my sister. And this quilt is called an Irish chain. And when you plan your quilt, you want to have a dark, a medium, and a light. And so this is pretty traditional where the light goes in the middle. There's a medium that runs along the edge of it. And then there's the dark. And inside the dark, my sister hand quilted shamrocks in each of the big green squares. So that's a traditional Irish chain. And then on the back side of the quilt, there's always some companion fabric that's not quite the same, or it may have parts that are the same, but this one is a very light green that has little tiny shamrocks on it. So it's the same theme as the rest of the quilt. And we're going to look at some antique quilts my sister-in-law has from her great aunts. She has a whole collection of antique squares, unfinished work. And then also we're going to look at this project, the Mass Quilts project, which is at the Quilt Museum in Lowell. Now there's a textile museum in Lowell that people know about, but there's also a quilt museum in Lowell. And they have a mass quilt project, and what they're trying to do with the quilt project is to have all of the quilts that were either made in Massachusetts or are presently located in Massachusetts on register. And quilts are a folk art, and they're a very American folk art. They're not really, they do quilts now over in Europe, but it's really the American pioneer really developed it to the art that we know it as. So let's look at these antique quilts. You can see how different the colors are with these quilts, the different patterns of fabric. These quilts are probably from 1930s. Very interesting. Obviously, her aunts were very good seamstresses. Spent a lot of time. Quilts traditionally are made with the leftover dress fabrics of the period. So they were just collecting squares together, and someday they would put them all together. And all of these patterns have names. Quilters they name, every quilt you make has a name, and every pattern has a name, and they name for the color combinations. And this is a completed quilt cover that hasn't had its bottom, its back, and batting put in to be quilted. You can see these are all the same pattern, and they look different because of the combination. This quilt that she's pulling, or cover that she's pulling out now, would be a daily use one. It's all squares. It's patterned based on which fabric is placed where. And it would be a daily use rather than a special occasion quilt. You didn't go out to Kmart then and buy your fabric. And one of the ways, this is a small completed piece. And one of the ways you date quilts is they actually look at the pattern of the fabric, the print, and the color, and they can tell approximately when the fabric was made. So my sister-in-law has a book that actually tells you by color what the dates of the fabrics are. And here's her book. And there's the blues, and the fabrics are all cataloged by color and approximate periods. So there's a pattern and a fabric. The Mass Quilt Project, as I said, at the Lowell Museum, these two women brought a quilt up, and I went up and filmed it. Unfortunately, there's no sound with this, but she's telling them what the quilt, about the quilt, the date of the quilt. And she's studying the make of the quilt. And you can look how deteriorated this quilt is, which helped them actually to date it. The quilt is from about 1880, and the quilt is actually silk velvet. And the silk velvet at the turn of the century, or just before the turn of the century, they put a lot of heavy metals in it to make it rustle. It gave it that nice rustle, because again, we're talking about clothing fabric. So this quilt has actually been stored in a chest for probably the last 50 years. Has deteriorated on its own, not because somebody did not take care of it. And one of the things that they were told by this quilt. She's measuring the actual dimensions of the squares and the dimensions of the pattern, counting the pattern. They're recording it all. And so because of the heavy metal, this will break down no matter what they do. And this is a woolen backing on it, this lovely paisley. And so she looks at it and studies it, and they note down all the details. And they'll do this, I think it's a $10 fee, and it's essentially as an art, they get a provenance. It's to have a history of quilt, of all the various quilts that exist. As a folk art, quilts are basically in the family tradition. They're not something that has been an art form so much as just the practical aspect. It has become an art form, and now people will care when quilts were made and who made them. And so getting that oral history down onto paper is part of what this whole project is trying to do. And so these are all volunteers who are working on this. So if you have a quilt and you want to go up, you can take it up to Lowell, make an appointment, and they will do this for your quilt. It takes about 20 minutes. And that includes teaching you how to fold it properly so that it does the least wear and tear on the quilt. Hi, welcome back. And so antique quilts are very fascinating. Hard to keep. People don't really know what do you do with them. My mom, with all the quilts that she makes, tries carefully not to make too many for us because we don't have wall space, and where are we all going to put them? But so a lot of quilting now you'll see ends up being small pieces that require the same amount of work. So my sister-in-law makes these lovely name quilts. Flanagan's a long name. It makes a long quilt. This is machine applique. Her detail work on these quilts is pretty amazing when you look at the fine stitching around the edges. It's all satin stitched around the edge. And then she's given me that one, and then she's given me this piece quilt. And if you look carefully at the pattern of the fabric, if you zoom in on the pattern of that fabric, it is bubble lights. It's Christmas bubble lights, which is something that has become a tradition in my household, which was not a tradition in our family household. So she found this bubble light fabric, and lo and behold, here it is on our little Christmas piece banner. And we have a couple of pillow cases that are also in that little bubble light pattern. So there's lots of ways to make quilts, and we're gonna look at a couple of different styles. And one is paper piecing. I don't actually have an example of paper piecing quilt, but paper piecing, there's a pattern that's sketched out in all straight lines with numbers on them, and you lay the fabric over and you stitch line number 1, and then you lay your next piece and you stitch line number 2 over that one, and you end up with this. And it's pretty amazing the forms that they get from this very structured, stylized thing. And we're going to look at that, and then we're going to look at a couple of other styles of quilt making. So this is paper piece. This is a pretty simple spiral, which is would be very difficult to do by cut pieces. But here's the pattern. It's actually stitched right on the back, and when you quilt them together, then you'll pull the paper off. But pattern number 1, number 2 is the full-size square, and the 3 above it. These 4 quilts you see are all paper pieced. If you look at this loom very carefully and you look at the background, you can see that he's paper pieced, and the only way you can paper piece is also all the background gets chopped up. And these are paper pieced together. It creates phenomenal accuracy. So my sister-in-law, who loves accuracy, just loves paper piecing. My mom tends to be a little more eclectic. And here's a little tiny pin that's been paper pieced together. And this is a paper pieced quilt pin that my mom and my sister-in-law both are in quilt guilds. Here's this amazing little thing. Each house in this quilt has 14 pieces in it. This whole quilt, well, each piece is 1.25 inches, 14 pieces. My sister-in-law loves it, and the guy who invented this, it's a man, and he has a 12 by 12 quilt that has 10,000 pieces in it. So don't ask me why you would want to do that, but so she's counting the pieces here. And a piece across the bottom, and the 2 pieces on the corner, and the piece across the roof line. And the tree has, I think the tree has 10 pieces in it. So the whole thing is 12 inches square. And there's almost 1,000 pieces in the whole thing. And here's the pattern that she worked from. And there's tells all the little numbers are there, and you just keep doing these little tiny squares, and then you sew them all together. And she just loves doing this size quilt. And this is the quilt my mom
So
made.
how simple could you get? I'll just do these little 1/4 inch pieces. And then I found you do them in strips. But they are so tiny, they are very hard to.
And this is a paper piece that my sister-in-law made for my
so
mother.
talk to me about
who
paper
collects
piecing.
dragons.
Okay, this is by my daughter-in-law, Martha. This is one of her paper piece.
And then my sister-in-law also does quilted vests. This is another one of her, because she's a school teacher, it's a way for her to do more quilting and wear it, show it off. So you set the quilt up, you make all your pieces, and you approximate where you want, and then you lay that pattern on it to cut out the vest itself. And this is a flying geese pattern on this vest, which are paper pieced together, and then the whole thing is inset into the rest of the vest. Mystery vest. Their quilt guilds have mystery blocks, and they give you one part of it at a time. And this is the mystery block that she made, and she made a vest out of it. And here's the big one on the back side. She continued to add another border around it to make it slightly larger. So there's 3 different squares, and then they're all put together to make a bigger pattern. This star is this star is called a stained glass technique. And then this is an applique. This base pattern for this porthole is just the goldfish, and all those other animals she found on other fabrics. So this is thread painting.
Promises of life, spirit lived.
So this is a photo that you then enlarge and figure out how to make an applique picture out of it, and the fabric hanging off is separate.
I swear in
This is Mom in some class.
embrace the light, come shining through, and you can see these promises of life, spirit lived.
And then the silk is burned and gives you that rough edge. And this is another photo quilt, and this is the house that they first moved to down in South Carolina.
Out of light and shifting land, and we were born to take its care in our hand. We were born out of light and shifting land. Oh, oh. We were born to pass it hand to hand. La la la.
And here's another example of, this is applique. Again, this is machine applique. And then this style applique, this is a picture I did. This is a picture, I call it a picture. It's not quilted, it's not lined. And this is this is a fairly new technique. It's iron-on applique. The mole on her face is the only piece of ink in this picture. Everything else is cut fabric. I actually traced the poster onto tracing paper and planned all my pieces and cut them out, and with some of the new iron-on glues, you can iron a piece of fabric onto another piece of fabric and seal it down, and that's what I did with this. It was very fun. It took me about a week. So there's essentially no sewing in this whole particular style of applique. But roller cutters are really important. So those are some of the techniques. We're gonna go to the next tape, which is gonna show some more traditional techniques of quilting. And before we get there, I want to show you just a couple of quilts. This particular style quilt has a long row of different colors. It's just graded from one to the other. And this is the use of curves, but it's pieced exactly the same way straight is. So you're just letting yourself be a little bit off. You can't do very sharp curves with it. Again, often these quilts are made at a class that, this is my mom did this in some class where she was just learning this technique, and the teacher just tells you to bring a whole collection of fabrics. And you make it, you have no idea what you're gonna make in the beginning. So we're gonna look at some very traditional style quilts right now. So this is an example of paper. This is another little paper piece. This is just traditional piecing. This is a baby quilt. Nice big pieces, nice simple to put together. Something you can actually put in the baby's crib. Hopefully, that's what they're for. This is my sister-in-law's hand dyes. Again, she likes very smooth hand dyes. This is around the world, and it's all squares pieced together. And just look at her amazing machine. She machine sews because her machine sewing is phenomenal. It's amazing. And this is called the watercolor, where you take one piece of fabric that's fairly bold print and you cut it all up and you gradate it. You use it sort of randomly, sort of. This is stack and whack is what this is called. So these 4 stars are all made with the same fabric. Again, a very large print. You cut a very specific part of the fabric out for each star. So you actually stack your fabric up, and then you chop out this print for this star and this print for this star. And when you go there, and all your things are named. And she always finds, she and my mom used clearly very different fabrics, and they just love going out and finding lots of different things.
Caught between a girl in her dreams and a woman who can't embrace what she sees. Don't you know they're one and the same, and someday they will live here in peace. Yes, someday you will live here in peace.
This is from a quilting retreat. Everybody swapped 2-inch squares with each other to make our 9-patch corners.
And I shall be like a
then,
beautifully designed
they were
quilt,
given
unseen by some, forgotten by
plain
many,
squares for everyone to
remembered by
sign.
others, and
They
treasured
didn't
by
know
a
what
few.
this was going to make, and then finally
And by
we
a few
gave them
treasured
the
forever.
computer printout of the poem in the center. And this is how I put mine together. It's a bit busy, but it's all the food we ate with a bug here and there, some ants and ladybugs, and a worm over there. Radishes, beets, onions, carrots, corn. And apples. Quilt Guild's logo in the center, and the magenta
This is
color
the
around
quilt she
it
proudly displays on her bag.
actually is the fabric that the blocks came to me wrapped in that magenta fabric. Then I
That's their logo.
found some more dark and light turquoise fabrics and did these on point squares, and then I liked it. The outer border is actually one piece of fabric that happened to have all the right colors.
So that's some more traditional quilting, and you know it gets hard when you talk about traditional quilts. You can go all the way back, and there's just this very long tradition in quilts, and so just standard piecing, and people keep coming up with new techniques, and we've gone down to the Quilt Museum. The National Quilt Museum is in Paducah, Kentucky, which you enter Kentucky and you go west until you hit the Ohio River, and then you're almost there. And it has about 1,500 quilts, antique quilts and modern quilts. Quilting it's huge down south. It's actually very big up here right now. It wasn't big in the 70s, the 80s sort of it started. But both my sister and my mother are in quilt guilds, and my sister-in-law, my oldest sister also quilts, and she is she's overseas, so she even joins quilt groups in Switzerland, and when she was in Switzerland, so she does her own quilting also. But they're very social, and one of the things you'll notice is that a lot of them were quilt challenges, mystery quilts, and so somebody decides on a challenge and they challenge everybody in the guild, and the guild people get to decide whether or not they want to participate. My mom's guild in South Carolina, the Sea Quilters Guild, which is the Sea Islands around Beaufort, has about 200 members in it. Her smaller quilt group has 50 or 60, and then they also have a smaller group of about 12 that meet on a regular basis. So they have all these layers. She has been president, and as president she helped the Quilt Guild create a large community quilt that they then shows at the bank or shows at different openings, and is sort of their fundraiser, here's who we are kind of quilt. They're proud of, and it's the Low Country quilt, and it depicts the area. So quilts often tell stories, they depict areas. They were using the Underground Railroad to give direction, to say whether it was safe to go ahead or not go ahead. Since quilts are just hung outside on the line, they could be used for all sorts of signals. So they have a very important and long history in our country. And we also have, and this is one piece that my mom brought back from Panama that's been quilted, and traditional piecing pieced work is also very common in the South Americas and down in the Caribbean. And this is all piece work, it's all hand applique and then hand embroidered, and the detail work is all embroidered on that. So she brought that back for me from this little trip she had. And what we're going to look at now are some three-dimensional quilts, which is a whole nother quilting style, and you think differently about what you're going to do and how you're going to make the quilt. So let's look at some 3D quilts. On the wall in their bedroom. A piece they couldn't make. This is what the woman who quilts all the time puts over her bed when something that she's not going to make.
All spangles. Us to make the pleats fold in the direction you want. I actually have a. This was a challenge.
And each one of these flowers has 2 layers of folded fabric and a little button in the middle. And she taught this as a little class to her quilt guild.
As you sew your squares together, you include a little pinwheel in the middle. A strip that I've always wanted to do, and our challenge had to use the Oriental fabrics. Take your finger and run around one side. You keep going and you are on the other side. Which is what a Mobius strip is all about. It has one side. Our challenge on this one was...
Hi. That was short. It's, again, 3D quilt making is still pretty new. When I was over visiting my sister when she was in Switzerland and got to go to one of her quilt guild meetings, and it was very interesting. Everybody was showing the kind of work they're doing, and Europe is actually learning from us. So as things change here and quilts grow and quilt makers grow, and people spend a lot of time, quilts are very expensive to make, because now people are buying fabric just to make quilts. So it's a whole different, it's an art form, and it's very different than the style form that it was before. My mom may spend 3 months to 6 months on a full-size quilt. She may conceive of one of her little quilts over the course of a couple of months. A challenge is given to a group. A quilt challenge in a guild is given a year in advance. So you may think about the theme, and the porthole one was endangered species, and so she sort of thought about that, and about 2 months before she starts working frantically. Whether you hand quilt a quilt, when you look at quilt competitions and they judge quilts and they compete with them, they look at whether it's been hand pieced or hand quilted, machine pieced, machine quilted, following the pattern, what kind of color use. I mean, the array of trying to judge the quality of the work. And the Quilt Museum in Paducah they have a national contest, and they pay $10,000 to the winner and acquire the quilt. And that's about about 700 of their 1,500 quilts are acquired that way. And so they're all hanging up, and we spent an 8-hour day just looking at about 150 quilts. And you get this close to them to see the differences in the quality of the work. So I want to do in closing, we've really covered sort of just some general and somewhat random. I mean, there was no real pattern to what we covered, how we covered quilts. I want to look at extreme, and I call it extreme, and it's not really quilting, but when you've been quilting for a long time and you've been sewing for a long time, what do you do with all those wild colors, and what do you do with all of that skill with a sewing machine? And I want to show you two of the things my mom did. The first one she did in a class, and the second one she actually used a pattern to do, when you see it, if you can believe it. And I want to thank you very much for joining me tonight in talking about quilts. And I expect that I'll be making more quilts when I retire, but I'm a long ways from retiring yet. I'm really too busy right now. Quilts take up too much time. So thank you and good evening. So this doll was made in this class my mother took. And the teacher painted the face because that's what the teacher knows how to do. So my mom does not take credit for painting the face. But it's really pretty amazing. She has little breasts, hand sewn on, applique. And then this one she used a pattern. She said it was the best pattern she's ever used. Everything was explained precisely. And this is Esmeralda. Esmeralda is about 2.5 feet long, about a foot high.
First,